Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next session in our CME Palooza Fall agenda. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza Fall, and I would like to welcome everyone to our 3 p.m. Eastern Time session titled Common and Not So Common Case Conundrums in CME. And this session is sponsored by CME Matters. Certainly I do a lot of case writing in my regular full-time job. Indeed, I have a regular full-time job outside of CME Palooza. This session is of particularly strong interest to me. So before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, our gold sponsor, Genentech, our silver sponsors, Helio Education Lab, Global Academy for Medical Education, Forefront Collaborative, CME Matters, and ASIM, as well as our bronze sponsors, Vindigo Medical Education, Thistle Editorial, RMEI, PVI, Primary Care Network, Platform Q Health Education, Paradigm Medical Communications, MyCME Haymarket Medical Education, Connective, Impact Education, I3 Health, Highmark CE, Ethos CE, CMEology, Clinical Care Options, and ACHL. You can go to our sponsor page at any time and learn more about any of these sponsors. So there are 3 ways to ask questions during this and all of our CME Palooza sessions. So first of all, you can click on the Google Slides link that you can find at the top of our live page. If you just click on the link for the Ask Questions During Scott's session, that'll take you to this Google Slides link. You can use our Google text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME, that's 0263. Or you could tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. We've had a lot of folks commenting a lot of interesting things throughout the day, so we hope that we'll keep that going throughout this session and the remainder of our sessions for our fall program. So quick speaker disclosure information. Just please note that the comments of our panelists today and during this and all sessions represent their own comments and are not an endorsement or position of their employer, parent company, or affiliates. So before we kind of bring in the first case here, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the session is going to unfold. So we have 2 panels, both with a moderator and 2 panelists. And yesterday on the CME Palooza website, we put up PDFs of the cases that each panel will be discussing. Certainly you were encouraged to read through the PDFs to get an understanding of what each case is going to be about. But we're going to review each case before we dive into some of the questions during this broadcast today, because we recognize that obviously not everyone is going to have read through the cases. So each panel will have about 25 minutes to talk through their case. There's multiple questions, multiple issues that are raised with each case. Certainly, if you have any additional questions you want to ask of or offer some comments, feel free to use any of the mechanisms that I outlined earlier. These are all also on the live page of the CME Palooza website. And so with that, I want to introduce our first panel. This is our Medical Education and Communications Company panel. And our moderator for this session, or for this part of this session, is Jan Perez. Jan is the managing partner at CME Outfitters, and she is joined by Michelle Montgomery. Michelle is the Senior Director of Educational Strategy of NACME LLC. And finally, Becky Carney. And Becky is the Senior Vice President of Educational Strategy of Integritas Communications. So thank you to the 3 of you for joining us. And Jan, I'm going to turn over to you to kind of talk through this first case.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. And we have a case today that I think a lot of people in the audience will relate to very well. So we'll jump right in. So Medical Education Company, Innovative Education, they were responding to an RFP and developed a proposal for a dinner satellite symposium at a major medical association meeting. You know, the team had gotten together, they had some great ideas, and when they put this proposal together, you know, it had it all. It had interaction, it had reflection, active learning, some gaming, some outcomes. The staff was so excited about the proposal that they put together. And really, this was a slam dunk. This was really going to be one of those proposals that they knew was going to be a go. You know, of course, innovation has a price tag associated with it. And so this was not going to be cheap. And so they thought, well, we better send this out to multiple commercial supporters to be sure that we're going to get it funded. And really everybody was going to want to be a part of this thing. First 3 weeks go by and they get their first approval. We're like, oh my God, this is great. We've got an approval. Another approval comes in not long after that, a smaller one. I mean, these guys were already thinking, we're putting this in for an award at the Alliance meeting. We've got this going. And then crickets. And then more crickets. And then the denials started coming through. And it really, they were just crestfallen. We got to the point that, time's approaching. They either had to pull the trigger or they've got to keep their faculty. They've got the best prime slot at the meeting. What are they going to do? Because they can't go through with this without incurring serious financial trouble. But it was going to take a lot of creativity and it was going to take a lot of sharp pencils. So here's where the conundrum comes in, and here's where I'm going to really lean on Becky and Michelle to kind of tell us really, how do we go about this and how do you handle this situation? So let's just first say, what is the first instinct in terms of how do you handle it? And Becky, I'm going to let you go first on this one. What's the first instinct that you would have as a team member for innovative education?
I won't tell you my very first. But I think the first thought is you have to inform the grantor. I mean, you're in the situation all funding is in. I think it gets more complicated if you have one hanger-on, one grantor who hasn't replied yet, and you're hoping. You don't want to have to endure a scope change when it would look bad and you potentially have more funding. But I think informing the grantor as soon as you can is important, but not before you've come up with some solutions and have identified, can we still achieve the learning objectives? Can I still come up with something that achieves the same effect as my sexy technology or the other pieces we put together? So I think communicating with the grantor, you have to do it quickly and be upfront, but be ready with solutions. And I think that's critical. And I guess be honest, we none of us want to offer the Rolls Royce and say, you really just get this Toyota. I guess in that case, we would have to remind them what a good car a Toyota is, and it'll still get you there. Mm-hmm. But I think that's my first response is just get it out there. You have to get everybody informed.
And it's interesting, at the first session this morning, they talked about change of scope, the commercial supporters in the grant session. And they talked about how, difficult it is to deal with the change of scope on everybody's perspective, because they really believed in the education when they approved it. And now does it mean different with that Toyota for that Rolls-Royce price? So, Michelle, I'm going to go to you. What are some creative things that, that you can think of that might be a way for us to get this done, keep it, again, aligned with the learning objectives, keep the scope of it in place without, when we only have partial funding?
Yeah, initially I had some ideas, and I think overall multi-support and partial funding is something that we constantly deal with, and there's just not really an easy answer or solution, because each time it's very different depending on the scenario. One of the questions, and maybe I can throw this back to you, Jan, is this just for the symposium, or do we have an enduring material or some other component to the grant initiative?
Now, this one was just the symposium, so we really kind of just have to deal with that, which is a really good point, because sometimes the enduring material might be an opportunity to find some economies there. But on this situation, it's just the symposium. Okay, I would. I agree with Becky in that you've got to talk to the grantors immediately. But first brainstorm, with your team about solutions. I mean, obviously we're looking at cutting down the budget, it looks like by 50%, it said. So are there ways to cut some other pieces that you can still have your creative approach? One being, did you have 3
faculty proposed, and can you cut down maybe a couple of your faculty to take out some of the costs and still do it within the amount of the grant? And then also looking at, can we do maybe even less marketing or different pieces, which may cut down on the number of learners reached, but it'll also lower something like food costs if we didn't know the situation that's coming up soon. I also think that when you're working, let's say if there's a technology partner or some other kind of partner involved, you know, get the group together and say, you know, we're all having to cut in different areas. We're not going to get all that, you know, all that we had requested, but are there ways that, you know, we can each say, okay, I can take this amount, you know, from the fee or, you know, whatever it is that we have proposed, and kind of meet in the middle with all the partners.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Michelle, because everybody's got a good stake in this being successful and this being taken off. Now, Becky, do you look at it from the perspective of let's try to take a little bit from a lot of things, or would you try to just say, okay, let's just forego one big thing to try to keep it as contained as possible? You know,
the additional information today that we only got halfway to the goal, and it's only for a symposium, makes it a lot harder. Michelle and I had brainstormed some solutions, but it was based on the thought that you might have a pre-study and the symposium and an enduring, that we would have more to work with. But thinking about a single symposium and you only get half, I mean, none of us are making 80%, you know, fees on this. Mm-hmm. So those are pass-through costs, and it's very hard when you're dealing with this situation of a single program to find that flexibility. If I can talk about the other scenario, you know, when you had a little bit more to choose from of what to cut, if you had multiple components, that's where I think we all find a challenge. If you had a 400K initiative that had a pre-study, that had a symposium, that had an enduring, and you got 250, you could look at it and come up with like a Chinese menu of options. We can cut the pre-study, go, you know, all out on the sexy symposium and scale back the enduring. Or we can go big on the enduring to maximize our reach and, you know, do bare bones symposium. What I have a hard time with is I can come up with those solutions, and some grantors you can call and say, okay, here are options. What's most important to you?
Right.
And they'll weigh in. But there's a good number of grantors who will say, oh, I can't comment on that. And I would love to hear if anybody can comment from the audience what your stance is on that as a grantor, because I disagree that that's going, you know, folks will quote standard 1 something. I looked up 1.1 that a supporter cannot have any influence, of course, on content, faculty, but one of the elements is educational design or intervention. And that's what they'll say, I can't tell you what to do. But I would disagree and say you can, in so much as you're choosing the format and the intervention when you approve a grant.
Right.
We can't say that you're not having an influence. So in this situation, for me, it's really important to try and understand what the grantor needs. Yeah. I don't know if they just funded a huge online initiative and that isn't so important to them. So I guess I would seek feedback in what really lit up your review committee. What was the, you know, thing you're most excited about?
Okay. All right. So we're going to keep moving because of our limited time. So we came up with these solutions. We provided some new ideas. There was a lot of pain, but we made it work. And so now we're kind of moving on to the next step of the process. We've found a way to make it work. Our faculty are confirmed. The catering is set. Content development's well on the way. We're finally feeling like, we're coming out the other end of this and we're feeling pretty good. But now, 3 weeks before the symposium, we get an email from our primary commercial supporters saying, even though it appears that CMS ruling says that that CME activities, you can now pay for food, we've got a crazy conservative compliance department and they say no food. Well, you know, I feel really bad, the commercial reporter says to you, but can you get creative? Is there a way that you can still make this happen? And so from the medical education perspective, you know, there's no mistaking that people who are going to come to this symposium are expecting to be fed. So here's the conundrum. You know, given that we've already done some cutting, but we do have the money set aside for food, what is our next step? Do you put skin in the game, so to speak, in terms of the medical education company saying, well, we are going to be a supporter of this educational initiative in addition to the traditional commercial supporter? Michelle, how have you had this come across, and how did you guys handle it?
I mean, I haven't had this particular situation come across, but in general, I mean, there's been different scenarios that have come up that in a way, and I believe Becky and I were pretty much in agreement on this, that you have to kind of push back a little bit at first and say, you know, we have a letter of agreement here that stated something else. That's how we've decided to, you know, implement this program, and possibly even show them something from, you know, the latest CMS and Sunshine rules that, you know, that it's okay with that guideline, and just basically, you know, be upfront about, is there any way that if this letter of agreement is already signed, that there's any way around this?
Becky, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a valid attempt, you know, to say, let's go back to your lawyers and remind them that we're under contract. That said, would we put skin in the game? In my past history, yeah, we sure have, for a half-day morning meeting or something, and we know the supporter won't provide food, out of our pockets, we'll provide coffee. But even that is, and we notify the attendees ahead of time and tell them why, you know, in their confirmation email. Thank you for coming. Due to restrictions, only coffee will be provided. Please come fed or be prepared. But you know, you guys work in the industry. You know, coffee in a hotel can cost $20 times 100 people. You know, you start taking a lot of hits. And in this situation, you are probably already barely paying for your travel to the meeting, you know, if you only got half of funding and made this work. So I think that it really wouldn't be an option. You know, for a dinner symposium, it can be $40,000 for food. I know that associations are getting smarter, and meeting groups are getting smarter in that they include meals in a person's registration. So not an issue, and I hope we see that continue in the industry.
And that's a really good point, because that has been a nice way that there have been situations where that has happened, where the meal is outside the door, but it's provided by the association as part of your registration fee. And that definitely does ease some of the tension, where more and more commercial supporters are saying we don't pay for food.
Another scenario that, you know, that we talked about was that, I mean, because both of us discussed that most likely our organization itself is not going to foot the bill, so to speak, for this. But that if we didn't offer anything because we couldn't work out anything with the association, and we were very clear to the learners about that before, that the attendance for this might go down in response. And that we would need to be very clear with the supporter about, you know, because of this change, you know, it could possibly, you know, cut your learners in half.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. So let's keep moving for our final part 3. Okay, we figured that part out. Roadblocks taken care of, and we're in the home stretch. Now, 3 days before the meeting, your chairman comes to you, gives you a call and says, oh, my academic medical center is kind of freaking out about the whole CMS thing, and says if my honorarium, my meals, my travel are going to be posted on a website. I can't do this. I might have to withdraw. So we personally have not had that happen, but we're trying to be proactive. What are some things that you guys have done, and Becky, I'll start with you, to be proactive with your faculty to really help to educate them about the CMS reporting process and what's involved?
Well, I think historically we've always, and we, depending on where I have been, have included a statement about Sunshine and CMS in the faculty agreement letter that just discloses all of that. I think that's the best thing you can do, and you need to. This is a moving target. We shouldn't have to in the future. And now at Integritas, we are not an accredited provider, and we partner with different groups. Some of those groups have a template and requirements for language for faculty agreement letters. Others don't. So I think in my situation now, in our situation as non-accredited providers, we can't make the assumption that somebody else is going to take care of that. In the end, if we are the ones responsible for executing this, for managing the faculty, we need to make sure that those disclosures are made just to protect ourselves and, you know, the execution of the program.
Exactly. Michelle, anything that you do a little different to proactively address this?
That's exactly what we do as far as putting it in a faculty agreement letter. Just as a, you know, a side anecdote, we a lot of times do programs with hospitals, grand rounds, bringing content in and doing this. And a lot of times there's a CME rule that, you know, we're not breaking, but individual either institutions or associations even have a separate rule above and beyond. So I think it's important to, even though if we're looking at the letter of the law and what CMS says about Sunshine and what ACCME says about disclosure, or, you know, whether sales reps can be present at a meeting and on, that we have to realize that the partners that we work with have other rules outside of those, including supporters that go above and beyond, even though we feel like we may be in compliance. So I think getting all of that information beforehand and making sure that you know the rules, you know, at each one of your supporters or each one of your partners before you know, get into a project that you're working on.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think just as we have done all along the steps, as things have changed and new rules have come into place, it's our job to educate our faculty so that they can educate people within their department so that they truly understand if there is a rule in place, make sure that they understand what it is so that they're interpreting it, you know, appropriately, and we can all win from it. Okay, we'll go. Well, there's Scott. I knew was just about to say we're about running out of time.
Actually, you've got a little bit of time. So there's a question that just came in. So so this came in on a text line, so I'm reading it off on my phone. So how do you manage a situation when you can't serve food? Because there are some grantors who will tell you flat out, we will not support symposia where there's food served. But competing symposia down the hall can serve food because their commercial supporter does allow it. How do you deal with that issue?
That's a tough one. I'm going to throw that one to Becky. Have you come across that?
I have not come across a situation where we didn't find a way to provide food. One of the options that we didn't talk about with this one is we could have assigned the food cost to the other supporter. You said there was two supporters on your program. So that is, it sounds like we didn't have a lot of money to work with anyway, but maybe that's what the food costs were assigned to the supporter without that limitation. I hate to say it, but in that case, you're going to lose attendees, or the poor other program is going to be feeding your attendees. And it's something to point out to the supporter, and it's a point of discussion to say, food shouldn't determine the value in attendance at a CME program, but sometimes it does.
Right. And
you guys are suffering because of this, and it is not part of CMS requirements. You didn't need to suffer this. I don't think there's any way around it once you're on site, and except to remind your supporter of your stance on the policies.
Michelle, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I would just put a huge poster outside the door that said free happy hour after the symposium. We'll meet you there at the bar. No, I don't think that there's anything else. I mean, it's going to take away from attendance. I've never been in that scenario. My organization organizes a lot of our own meetings. And so we don't, whenever we submit a grant, we do not include those costs in there to just completely avoid the situation. Mm-hmm. We include it in the registration fee that the attendees are paying to attend the meeting in the first place. And so we don't ever have that issue. And we've, purposely done that. Maybe that's something that the association partners, that are here on this call could weigh in on, of something that maybe they've thought about, that's something that's included as part of their, a lot of these attendees are paying large registration fees, and, maybe that's something for the way of the future.
Okay. So one more question that that kind of came up. So there are some grantors who require with your initial grant submission that you spell out how you would change the education if you only receive 50% or 60% or whatever, and you kind of have to determine upfront what you would do differently. Is it a good idea to sit down proactively before the grant is even submitted to kind of come up with your tactics, whether or not the grantor actually asks for that or not?
And I'll jump in on this one. I think that, contingency plans, when you're putting that many different elements that are going to inflate the budget, and as excited as you are and as how much you think this is a slam dunk, you do really, it's just smart to plan ahead, to have a contingency plan so that you don't get yourself into a situation where you're having to kind of, backpedal on the back end. So I think it makes a whole lot of sense. I certainly wouldn't want to give up the farm right from the get-go in terms of that contingency plan. But if you go in without a plan B, you're probably going to find yourself in trouble. Becky or Michelle, do you have anything to add to?
We always put a contingency plan now on all of our grant proposals that are multi-support, even if it's not multi-support, and then even if it's sole support, but there's multiple components, we will even say at this level, this is, what's going to happen. But I will say that even putting that in the grants, you still have to submit a change of scope each time, and there's still the possibility that that change of scope is not going to get approved.
Yeah, and I would just say that I like developing contingency plans, especially when it's very cut and dry. You can have symposia with bells and whistles or without, with 2 endurings or with 1, but it gets very complicated if you have a big initiative with 5 potential supporters, 10 live meetings, 2 of this, 1 of that. You have too many options, and you have no idea if you're going to get $258,000 or 601. It could be a ring of hell. Just trying to figure out all of your permutations. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys, and you guys want to hang on? We're gonna move on to our second case with our second panel. So before we do, I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions, there are 3 ways to ask questions. You can use the Google slide links found on our live page. You can use our Google text line, which is 267-666-0263, or you can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. So our second panel, let me introduce the 3 ladies we have on this panel. This is our hospital-based folks. So our moderator is Andrea Harshman. Andrea is the director of the Office of Professional Education at National Jewish Health in Denver. And she's joined today by Laura Wirtz. Laura is the Director of Continuing Medical Education at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. And finally, we have Kaylin Parks. And Kaylin is the Manager of Physician Education and Medical Libraries at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Andrea to sort of introduce and walk us through this particular case.
All right. Thank you, Scott. I will say, after hearing this last case, this one seems a little simple. So I feel for my medical education company colleagues. But I'll go ahead and just get started. You are the CME director at a large academic center that, among other initiatives, coordinates dozens of grand rounds presentations throughout the year. One morning, the content for your weekly Department of Medicine grand rounds is sent to your office for review, which is standard practice. Upon review of the presentation, which is entitled "The Colorado Tobacco Tax Initiative and Current Smoking Cessation Resources at Our Hospital," you notice a potential biased political nature to the presentation. The presentation is scheduled that day at noon. The first half of the presentation includes a pretty detailed discussion of the proposed tax initiative that will be on the upcoming November ballot. The content includes references to health facts and data showing that tax increases do indeed reduce smoking rates and improve public health. The other side of the debate, which focuses on the overall financial burden to taxpayers for this expensive initiative, is presented but quickly negated. The remaining parts of the submitted presentation discuss internal resources that may be used to address tobacco cessation with patients at your hospital and are generally not a concern from your perspective. The nature of the content makes it clear that the presenters, who are all faculty within your organization, support the tobacco tax initiative and are encouraging their colleagues to vote yes on the ballot question. On their financial disclosure form, the presenting faculty disclose no financial relationships. They do, however, include a slide with the presentation to disclose that they sit on the task force of the proposed tax initiative. So, questions to consider. How would you handle this situation? To whom would you raise your concerns? And I don't know, Laura, I'll pick you first to maybe get your thoughts.
So Kaylin and I actually talked about this a bit yesterday. What I find interesting, I think both of us did, I wouldn't actually come up with this situation very often because we don't review content. It's not a part of our standard process unless there is a financial relationship to disclose, a relevant one. Now we do have one, we have about 60 RSSs that we give credit for, and it's just not feasible to be able to do that. Now we do have one where we're actually the primary planners for it, and we're the ones who actually help to develop the content, and people can come to us with ideas. We did have somebody who wanted to bring in an outside speaker on something that, like this, could be a little controversial. And so what we did end up doing is we raised it to the stakeholders in our organization. We first up through our reporting structure to see if the hospital had an official stance on it, to make sure that whatever we were going to present didn't contradict anything that from a hospital perspective we would want to get out there.
Yeah, I would say
Oh,
Did we lose Kaylin's audio?
I'm sorry?
Oh, there she is.
yeah, we lost you.
I lost you for a second, Kaylin.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that I would leverage my internal partnerships or relationships. So that be internal communications. We work directly with a consultant for our health system to do that. I would leverage that partnership. I would also, since we're a pediatric institution, I would refer to the pediatrician in chief, his content expertise on this. Again, we're similar to Laura that we don't actually review the content for our RSSs. We have about 50 RSSs. So again, just the volume and the quantity, it's not realistic for us to review the content for each one. So I would try to look at, do you have a CME committee, a medical education committee that you could kind of tap to help you navigate this process day of?
And that makes all kinds of sense. We are unique in that we actually have a minimal number of grand rounds at National Jewish Health that we certify that come through our office. We kind of operate as a MEC within an academic center. So understand that it probably isn't how that works. But we do actually review all of the material beforehand. So.
I will say one thing that you would have to consider is if there were multiple kinds of credit being offered and if CME wasn't the only concern. So I know that there are disciplines for which if you were on a political, if you have some sort of political bias, they have to disclose that and they have to resolve it. So it's not just about the commercial interest part of it. So that's just another consideration.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the other question. Should the presenters be disqualified from giving this talk due to their possible conflict of interest?
So I would say no, because their conflict of interest, or what the case says is a conflict of interest, is not a commercial entity. They're disclosing that they're on this task force for the proposed tax initiative, but that's not a commercial interest if you refer to the ACCME. Andrea, side note here, when Laura and I were talking yesterday, this case reminded me of a special situation that we had back in the summer of 2015 when we gave a presentation at our general pediatric grand rounds on medical marijuana. And it was a controversial topic, a hot topic, and we needed to, like I said, use our internal stakeholders to help us navigate that presentation. A little bit about children's health care. We have three hospitals within the metro Atlanta area, and this was at one of our grand rounds that our faculty member was giving a presentation on medical marijuana. We wanted to make sure that from a system perspective, the content that she was providing was something that as a system our leadership supported, reviewed and agreed with, and provided the appropriate education. So this case kind of reminded me of that. We had to make sure that from a policy perspective that we were okay. That's where we engaged our internal communications team and our pediatrician in chief to kind of help navigate that.
That was actually going to be, if I needed to do more than one case, a medical marijuana a meeting was my other one. So we lived through a similar thing related to that.
Yeah, and I think, one of your follow-up questions is, does this content, should it be certified for CME? And for us with the medical marijuana situation, it was certified for CME. It was important for our medical staff to understand the state and national policy, and also what they were allowed to do on site at the hospital, how they were allowed to practice, what resources could they give to patient and families. So and also the clinical research aspect, what was the latest in the research field on this. So I think it should be certified for CME content.
Yeah, and I would agree with Kaylin that it's very important that providers are aware of policy type issues, and particularly, like I'm assuming with the tobacco cessation one, you don't want people to smoke. It's a health concern. You don't want people to smoke. So particularly if your hospital or health system is taking a point of view on that, and they're saying we're behind this and we don't want people to smoke, and we're in charge of this, or we agree with this being a way to try to prevent it, they should be aware of what their employer stands for in the public health realm and within their community.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So does the content represent a commercial bias from the standpoint of meeting the ACCME standards for commercial support?
No, I mean, it's not a commercial interest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I know Kaylin already answered the question, but should this activity be certified? And then just, I guess, as a follow-up, in general, how do you make this determination for individual activities presented within your facility? And I think Kaylin talked a little bit about that, but.
Yeah, and I think too, you have to keep in mind for our grand rounds, we really try to keep in mind who is the target audience. For us, it's general pediatricians and family practitioners, and what are the overall objectives, not for just that session, but for the grand rounds throughout the course of the year. So if you keep those two things in mind, it kind of helps guide the content that you're going to be presenting.
And I think you do kind of what Kaylin was talking about, leveraging the people within your system or your hospital. When you're developing and deciding on the content, I think you also don't forget to include your policy people, the folks in your legal department. What are things that they see that people need to be aware of, and don't forget about that kind of content, because it's really important to address.
So we have a question that came in, and this is probably for both Kaylin or Laura. So what have you seen are the dangers of coordinating such a large number of RSS programs with, you know, relatively limited oversight just because of the manpower in your departments?
Well, I mean, I can go first. We have seen where people have not been in compliance, and we found out after the fact. And so we have a policy in place about how to deal with that. We have kind of a semi-centralized system in that we have a system set up where 99% of the time we're going to catch from a disclosure standpoint. We haven't had too many issues that have really come up about content and any controversies around the content.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Laura. We're probably set up similar just because of the quantity that we do. I think one of the dangers we have as a system is our internal way that we organize our RSSs. We use a lot of manual systems and processes, and we're trying to move away from that, but it's hard for us to kind of enter 2016 technology, but we're working on it. I think also our medical staff really would like people want their CME report that day, and they want it current. And if you're still in the manual phase of things and your program is 50 plus RSSs, it can be difficult. So there are some dangers to organization and timeliness, I would say.
So I was just going to follow up. So so this was a real situation about a month ago, and for me, the reason it kind of had some red flags was more just, you know, it's a slippery slope on, it seemed like, around political views. I did do what Laura recommended and find out from the standpoint of our organization, I found this out actually after the fact, but that we officially endorsed that initiative as an organization. And so that made sense. But, you know, when you kind of have an hour, like, is this a problem? I felt fairly comfortable with what I felt from a CME standpoint. It really did lean more towards, was this a issue for our institution, and kind of having basically your colleagues tell you to vote something on a ballot initiative. That's where it got a little sketchy, and just wanted to kind of go through and make sure that we were that was all good. So I did email the ACCME and ask them their thoughts on it. And so I'm not sure if people are interested to know what they said, but I was going to go ahead and read their response. I think that's the next slide, Scott. You know, thank you for your question. The ACCME standards for commercial support, standards to ensure independence in CME activities, address financial relationships with any commercial bias concerning ACCME defined commercial interests. So they had links to all of this. So I reread that. There wasn't a commercial interest at play here. As the credit provider, it's up to you to ensure that the content meets the definition of CME and the ACCME's clinical content validity policies. So if all those things were met, which I did look at, you know, the facts, the content was referenced, it seemed to me all the clinical content validity policies that the ACCME referenced, and then basically said that would not prohibit what I described in my question. So I think it was just more, it was like the first to kind of see something political, and it did kind of cause us all pause. And so that's why I presented it as a conundrum.
Yeah, I think I think it does bring up a good point, and something that came up on the earlier panel as well, is that ACCME compliance is only one part of what you have to consider when you're looking at content. You know, you have to look at What's the environment that you're working in? What are the rules within your particular hospital? And frankly, what are the views of whoever your physician planner is or whoever your department head is? All of those things have to be considered along with the compliance part.
Right.
So here's another question that came in. So and probably this is specifically for you, Andrea. On a larger picture scale, were you concerned that your attendees were not going to consider this an educational topic?
I think at first, because it was kind of heavy on the initiative side, but really when, going through all of the content, it was clearly around the health benefits of smoking cessation, how we are the leading respiratory hospital, right? So that's a particular focus of ours. So it's really focused on that. And then it was on resources within our own institution to make sure we're addressing tobacco cessation and that sort of thing. So initially that was a concern, that it was going to be more of a commercial for the tax initiative, which it was briefly, but then really why that's important that we lower smoking rates and what are the resources we have here internally to do that.
So did you attend the actual program itself?
I did not.
You did not.
I did not. So we don't attend all of them. I mean, within our office, obviously, there are lots of people attending them. So I didn't. And what I will say is, we did actually ask for the faculty to kind of temper the kind of negating the other side. Like basically, they had a slide where it was like, here's all their kind of counterpoints, and then it just said wrong on it. And I thought, maybe, so really more from the standpoint of, think about your audience, and, you probably don't need to tell them that's wrong. They're pulmonologists and, internal medicine folks, like, they probably can figure that out on their own. So we did ask them to do that. There was one slide that actually had a name brand of a nicotine replacement. I had them change that. I didn't think that was really the conundrum there, but so we did ask them to address that, and it was.
Okay, so here's a question sort of for the entire panel, and if folks from the MEC team want to comment on this as well, you certainly can. So how do you determine when you want to elevate an issue or ask a question of the accrediting body itself? In this situation, obviously, Andrea, you felt you were unsure enough that you wanted to make sure that the ACCME, that you had their opinion on the matter as well. So maybe folks can talk a little about their experiences in getting answers on some of their issues with an accrediting body and maybe how that's gone for them.
So I'll just say in this situation, I felt pretty confident with the discussion I had with internally the accreditations manager here in my department, that we were okay from the ACCME standpoint. But sometimes it's just, I'm curious to see how they might respond. Here's my experience with the ACCME. They're never really going to give you a yes and no answer. They're going to help you think through, and then you kind of need to validate the way you reacted or acted on something. So that's been my experience. I don't know if other folks.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, because what we found is we have started giving very specific scenarios if we have questions. We've had a few around the whole use of corporate logos and how that fits with sponsorship and where it can be, where it can't be, what we can offer to people. And so what we do is we lay it out all very specifically. And usually the last question is, in this situation, would this be considered compliant?
And do they answer yes or no?
A lot of times they do. I mean, sometimes they've come back and said, can you give us more information? But they're very good in that they'll say, in the scenario in which you've described, this would be compliant. We would consider this to be compliant. So, I mean, they're trying, and I understand, that they have to be very specific. And so we try to ask as specific questions as we can.
And now
I was just going to jump in and say that I think a lot of providers are almost scared to ask a question because then they think it's going to come back at, their accreditation review time or something. But the overall feeling that I get, and I've asked many questions to many different accrediting bodies in the past, that I agree with what you say about ACCME. It doesn't tend to be exactly black or white, but then the guidelines are not always black or white. If you look at accreditations like ACPE, it's very, very direct as to what is compliance and what is not, and you will get a very direct answer from them as well.
So what sort of turnaround time do you guys usually expect or get when you have a question for any of these accrediting bodies?
I don't think this really has applied to me so much because we're in constant communication with our accredited partners. We do ask them to review everything, you know, from initial submissions to agendas to promotional pieces, and of course the content. So everything we do is reviewed in an ongoing way. So I guess I expect, just because we have an ongoing dialogue, a pretty immediate reply.
I think the question was more for when you have a question for the ACCME or ANCC or ACPE. How long does it typically take for them to get back to you?
For ACCME, I mean, we've usually found it within 48 hours.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, there are no other questions that have come in for this session. So I want to thank our panels for a very interesting and robust discussion. I always like these sessions that sort of answer some real life issues. So I hope people that got a lot out of it. So for those who are watching this either live or after the fact, we do have a CME Palooza Fall survey. So the link is on the bottom of our live tab. So if you can please take a minute or two to complete the survey. It's very short. We always use it to help plan our future events. For folks who are interested in watching our next session, which is our last session of the day, which we traditionally conclude with our Puntua Lortu session. We'll start that here in 8 minutes at the top of the hour, so at 4 o'clock Eastern time. So once we shut down this broadcast, you'll just need to refresh the page at 4 o'clock. And with that, I'd like to thank Jan, Michelle, Becky, Andrea, Laura, and Kaylin for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.